Number 1. Tyler Hadley. On the night of July 16, 2011, a quiet suburban home in Port St. Lucie, Florida, became the setting for one of the most disturbing crimes of the decade, not because of what happened inside, but because of what followed afterward. At the center of it all was Tyler Hadley, a 17-year-old high school student who, on the surface, looked like an ordinary teenager. He lived with his parents, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, in a modest, well-kept home. Friends described him as socially awkward, occasionally bullied, and deeply insecure. But nothing about his outward behavior suggested what he had been planning. For weeks, Tyler had been telling classmates and friends that a party was coming, a big one. He talked about it obsessively. What no one realized was that the party was the final step in a plan he had already committed to carrying out. Tyler's parents had recently discovered that he was struggling with drug use. Concerned and trying to intervene, they made arrangements for him to enter an inpatient drug treatment program. To them, it was a last attempt to help their son regain control of his life. To Tyler, it was an unacceptable loss of freedom. In messages to friends, he complained that his life was being ruined. In private, his thinking grew darker. He later admitted he had begun planning their deaths weeks in advance, even telling one acquaintance that killing his parents and then throwing a party afterward would be something that had never been done before. That Saturday evening, Mary Jo Hadley was sitting in the family room working on her computer. Without warning, Tyler approached her from behind, holding a 17-inch framing hammer. He struck her again and again, delivering at least 36 blows, mostly to her head and upper body. The attack was brutal and sustained. There was no evidence of a struggle long enough to suggest she had time to react. When his father, Blake Hadley, heard the noise and came to investigate, Tyler turned on him next. Blake was hit at least 39 times in the head and chest. The force was so extreme that the medical examiner later described the injuries as catastrophic. When it was over, both of his parents were dead on the floor of their own home. Instead of fleeing or calling for help, Tyler began cleaning. He dragged both bodies into the master bedroom, locked the door, and stacked objects in front of it in an attempt to conceal what he had done. Bloodstains were wiped down as best he could manage. Then, with the house quiet again, Tyler moved on to the part of the plan he had been looking forward to the most. He logged onto Facebook and posted an invitation. "Party at my crib tonight. Maybe." Word spread quickly. Within hours, 40 to 60 teenagers arrived at the Hadley home. Music blasted, alcohol flowed, people danced, laughed, and filled every room. Just a few feet away, behind a locked bedroom door, the bodies of Blake and Mary Jo Hadley lay hidden. Several partygoers later reported that they noticed a strange smell in the house. Some said Tyler made unsettling comments, casually telling people that his parents were dead. Most assumed he was joking or trying to shock them. A few didn't believe him. Others did, but stayed anyway. At some point during the party, Tyler confided in his best friend, Michael Mandel, and told him the truth. Mandel eventually opened the locked bedroom door and saw the bodies. Instead of calling police immediately, he returned to the party. Hours passed. The music continued. It wasn't until later that night, after the reality fully set in, that Mandel contacted authorities. Police arrived to find a house still littered with cups, bottles, and teenagers who had only just begun to realize the gravity of what had happened. Tyler was taken into custody without resistance. During questioning, he was calm and direct. He admitted to killing both parents and showed little emotional response. Investigators quickly learned that the murders were not impulsive. Tyler had researched methods, discussed his intentions with others, and carefully timed the party to follow the killings. In court, the details were laid out piece by piece. Prosecutors emphasized the planning, the number of blows, and the sheer indifference Tyler showed afterward. The defense did not deny responsibility. In 2014, Tyler pleaded no contest to 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Robert Makomson sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. However, the case did not end there. Changes in juvenile sentencing laws, driven by U.S. Supreme Court rulings that limited mandatory life sentences for crimes committed by minors, forced the courts to revisit Tyler's punishment. In December 2018, he was resentenced. The judge again imposed life in prison, determining that Tyler's actions demonstrated irreparable corruption rather than youthful impulsivity. Today, Tyler Hadley remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence for murdering the 2 people who tried to help him, a crime made even more chilling by the hours-long celebration that followed and the cold calculation behind every step that led to it. Number 2. Theodore Wafer. In the early hours of November 2, 2013, a quiet residential street in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, was silent except for a single porch light glowing in the dark. By sunrise, that porch would become the center of a national debate about fear, race, and the limits of self-defense. The man who lived there was Theodore Wafer, a 55-year-old divorced factory worker who lived alone in a small bungalow. Neighbors described him as private, reclusive, and intensely wary of the outside world. He kept a loaded 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun inside his home and had previously complained to police about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. To Wafer, danger was always close, even when nothing was happening. Several miles away, 19-year-old Renisha McBride was having a very different night. She had been drinking heavily and smoking marijuana while riding as a passenger in a car. In the early morning hours, she crashed the vehicle into a parked car near Inkster, Michigan. The crash was not severe, but Renisha was disoriented and intoxicated. Toxicology later showed her blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit. Instead of calling for help immediately, she wandered away from the crash scene into a nearby neighborhood. For nearly 3 hours, Renisha walked alone in the dark. She knocked on doors, trying to get help. No one answered. Eventually, she approached Theodore Wafer's house. Security footage and witness testimony later established that Renisha stepped onto Wafer's front porch and began knocking and banging on the door. The noise woke Wafer from sleep. Inside, he later claimed the pounding felt violent and aggressive, enough to make the floor vibrate. Alone, half asleep, and already anxious about crime, Wafer assumed someone was trying to break into his home. Instead of calling 911, Wafer went to his bedroom and retrieved his shotgun. He loaded it. He walked back to the front door. According to his own statements, he did not turn on the porch light to see who was outside. He did not shout a warning. He did not ask who was there. Wafer opened the inner wooden door, but left the locked screen door in place. Almost immediately, he fired a single blast through the screen. The shotgun blast struck Renisha McBride in the face, killing her instantly. She collapsed backward off the porch and onto the lawn. After the shot, Wafer closed the door. He did not call police. He did not render aid. He did not check on the person he had just shot. Instead, he retreated into his home and waited. When officers arrived later, responding to a call placed after daylight, they found Renisha's body outside, unarmed. No weapon was ever found on her or near the porch. Inside the house, Wafer told police he was full of piss and vinegar when he opened the door and pulled the trigger, a statement that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Wafer insisted he believed his life was in danger. He claimed the pounding sounded like someone trying to force entry, and that he acted purely out of fear. But investigators quickly focused on what he didn't do. He never attempted to identify the person outside. He never called 911 before or after the shooting. He never issued a verbal warning. These omissions mattered. The case exploded into the national spotlight. Renisha McBride was black. Theodore Wafer was white. Comparisons were immediately drawn to the Trayvon Martin shooting and broader questions about racial bias in perceived threats. Michigan does not have a traditional stand-your-ground law, but self-defense claims still hinge on whether fear is reasonable. Prosecutors argued Wafer's fear was not. At trial, the jury heard expert testimony about the shotgun blast, the trajectory, and the distance. They saw photographs of the porch and the door. They listened to Wafer's recorded police interview, including his admission of anger. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who reacted not just out of fear, but out of irritation and hostility, choosing lethal force without exhausting any alternative. The defense countered that Wafer was a frightened homeowner startled awake in the middle of the night. They argued Renish's intoxication explained the aggressive knocking and that Wafer had only seconds to react. But the lack of a 911 call and the decision to fire blindly through a door proved difficult to overcome. On August 7, 2014, the jury returned its verdict. Theodore Wafer was found guilty of second-degree murder, manslaughter, and felony firearm use. The courtroom fell silent as the decision was read. For Renish's family, it was validation that her life had value. For Wafer, it was the collapse of his self-defense claim. At sentencing on September 3, 2014, Judge Dana Hathaway addressed Wafer directly. She said she did not believe he was a cold-blooded murderer, but made it clear that his actions were driven by fear, anger, and panic, not necessity. She sentenced him to 15 to 30 years in prison, setting a minimum of 17 years before parole eligibility. The case left a lasting impact far beyond the courtroom. It became a reference point in discussions about how fear is judged, whose fear is believed, and how quickly deadly force can be justified based on assumptions rather than facts. Renisha McBride went to a porch looking for help. Theodore Wafer answered with a shotgun, and a single decision in the dark ended two lives in very different ways. Number 3, Oscar Pistorius. In the early hours of Valentine's Day 2013, behind the gated walls of a luxury home in Pretoria, South Africa, a series of gunshots shattered the life of one of the most famous athletes on the planet and turned a global sports icon into a convicted killer. The man at the center of it was Oscar Pistorius, a double amputee sprinter celebrated worldwide as the Blade Runner. Pistorius had overcome the loss of both legs below the knee as a child to become a Paralympic champion and the first amputee to compete in the Olympic Games. He was admired as a symbol of determination, resilience, and triumph over adversity. Publicly, he represented inspiration. Privately, his life was far more volatile. Pistorius was dating Riva Steenkamp, a 29-year-old model and law graduate who was beginning to establish her own career and public identity. Friends described Riva as intelligent, independent, and cautious. Their relationship, however, was turbulent. Text messages later introduced at trial showed arguments, jealousy, and Riva expressing fear over Pistorius's temper and gun habits. On the night of February 13, 2013, the couple spent the evening together at Pistorius's home. What happened inside that house remains one of the most scrutinized timelines in modern criminal trials. In the early morning hours, Pistorius fired 4 shots from a 9mm pistol through a locked bathroom door. On the other side of that door was Riva Steenkamp. She was struck multiple times and died at the scene. Pistorius claimed he believed an intruder had entered the bathroom and that he fired in a panic, fearing for his life. He said he did not realize Riva was inside, believing she was still in bed. Prosecutors immediately challenged this version of events. They argued there was no intruder, that Pistorius knew Riva was in the bathroom, and that the shooting followed an argument. The physical evidence became central. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. Riva had gone into the bathroom sometime earlier. The shots were fired in quick succession. Forensic experts testified about bullet trajectories, timing, and the improbability of Pistorius's claim that he did not know who was behind the door. Text messages revealed Riva had felt controlled and unsafe in the relationship, undermining the image of a loving couple surprised by a random break-in. The trial, which began in 2014, was broadcast live across South Africa and streamed worldwide. Every detail was dissected. Pistorius's emotional testimony, in which he wept and vomited in court, polarized public opinion. Some saw genuine remorse and vulnerability. Others saw performance and manipulation. In September 2014, Judge Thokozile Masipa delivered her verdict. She acquitted Pistorius of premeditated murder, stating that the prosecution had not proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt. However, she found him guilty of culpable homicide, the South African equivalent of manslaughter, ruling that he had acted negligently by firing blindly through a door without confirming who was behind it. On October 21, 2014, Pistorius was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the killing of Riva Steenkamp, along with a suspended sentence on a separate firearms charge. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Many believed the sentence was far too lenient, especially given Pistorius's fame and privilege. Critics argued that an ordinary citizen would not have received such treatment. Their concerns were not unfounded. In October 2015, after serving just 10 months, Pistorius was released from prison and placed under house arrest. Public outrage intensified. Prosecutors appealed the verdict, arguing that the court had misapplied the law regarding intent. In December 2015, South Africa's Supreme Court of Appeal agreed. The court ruled that Pistorius should have foreseen that firing 4 bullets through a closed door would almost certainly kill whoever was inside, regardless of whether he believed that person was an intruder. The culpable homicide conviction was overturned and replaced with a conviction for murder under the legal principle of dolus eventualis. Pistorius was resentenced in 2016 to 6 years in prison. Prosecutors appealed again, arguing the sentence was still too light. In 2017, the court increased his sentence to 13 years and 5 months, finally aligning the punishment more closely with the severity of the crime. Over time, the narrative surrounding Oscar Pistorius changed completely. The inspirational athlete was replaced by the image of a man whose insecurity, fear, and recklessness had cost an innocent woman her life. Riva Steenkamp's family continued to speak publicly, emphasizing that her voice should not be lost amid discussions of Pistorius's downfall. On January 5, 2024, Pistorius was released on parole after serving approximately 8.5 years in prison. His release reignited debate, but the legal record was final. Oscar Pistorius was no longer a symbol of human achievement. He was, and remains, a convicted murderer whose legacy is forever defined by 4 gunshots fired through a bathroom door. Number 4. Michael Dunn. On November 23, 2012, the day after Thanksgiving, a routine stop at a gas station in Jacksonville, Florida, turned into a killing that would ignite national outrage and expose how quickly fear, anger, and assumptions can turn deadly. The man who pulled the trigger was Michael Dunn, a 47-year-old software developer from Satellite Beach. Dunn was traveling with his fiancée after attending his son's wedding. By all outward appearances, it was an ordinary holiday weekend. What followed would permanently define his life and end another. At a Jacksonville gas station, Dunn parked next to an SUV occupied by 4 black teenagers, including 17-year-old Jordan Davis. Music was playing loudly from the vehicle. Dunn rolled down his window and asked the teens to turn it down. The request quickly escalated into a heated verbal exchange. Witnesses later described raised voices and profanity. What mattered most was how Dunn interpreted the moment. Dunn claimed that during the argument, Jordan Davis threatened him, and that he saw Davis reach for what he believed was a shotgun inside the vehicle. No one else saw a weapon. No weapon was ever recovered. But in that moment, Dunn made a decision that could not be undone. He reached into his glove compartment, pulled out a 9mm handgun, and began firing into the SUV. 10 shots were fired in 3 separate bursts as the vehicle attempted to flee. 3 bullets struck Jordan Davis. 1 pierced his chest, killing him. The other teenagers escaped physically unharmed, but their lives were permanently altered. After the shooting, Michael Dunn did not call 911. He did not check on the teenagers. He did not wait for police. Instead, he drove away from the scene with his fiancée. They returned to their hotel, ordered pizza, walked the dog, and went to sleep. The next morning, Dunn drove 150 miles back home without ever contacting authorities. Police quickly identified Dunn as the shooter. When questioned, he maintained that he acted in self-defense, insisting he had seen a weapon and feared for his life. Investigators focused on inconsistencies in his story and the total absence of any firearm in the teen's vehicle. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, and forensic evidence contradicted key aspects of Dunn's account. The case went to trial in February 2014. Prosecutors argued that Dunn acted out of rage and entitlement, not fear, and that his actions were driven by an unwillingness to be challenged. The defense leaned heavily on Florida's self-defense statutes, suggesting that Dunn reasonably believed deadly force was necessary. The jury partially agreed and partially did not. Dunn was convicted on 3 counts of attempted second-degree murder for shooting at Jordan's friends and 1 count of firing into an occupied vehicle. However, the jury deadlocked on the charge of first-degree murder for Jordan Davis's death. The mistrial on the murder count stunned many observers and fueled debate about race, credibility, and whose fear the justice system chooses to validate. A retrial on the murder charge was scheduled for October 2014. This time, the prosecution narrowed its focus. Jurors were walked step by step through Dunn's actions, from the argument to the final shots to his calm behavior afterward. They heard recordings of Dunn's jailhouse phone calls, in which he used racial slurs and mocked the teens. The tone of those calls severely damaged his claim that he was a reluctant defender acting under extreme stress. On October 1, 2014, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Michael Dunn was found guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing on October 17, 2014, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Jordan Davis's mother, Lucia McBath, addressed Dunn directly. She said she chose to forgive him, not for his sake, but for her own healing. Jordan's father, Ron Davis, took a different stance. He said Dunn's apology rang hollow and lacked genuine remorse. The judge had no discretion. Under Florida law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence. Michael Dunn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 90 years for the attempted murder convictions, served consecutively. The case became a flashpoint in national conversations about self-defense laws, racial bias, and gun violence. While Florida's Stand Your Ground law was not formally invoked in Dunn's defense, the principles behind it loomed over every stage of the proceedings. Critics argued that the idea of reasonable fear too often hinges on stereotypes rather than facts. Jordan Davis was unarmed. He was sitting in a car with friends, listening to music. Michael Dunn survived the encounter completely unharmed, yet one man went home that night and one did not. Michael Dunn will spend the rest of his life in prison, not because of loud music, but because he chose to respond to a perceived slight with a gun. The argument lasted minutes. The consequences are permanent. Number 5. Miranda and Elite Barber. On November 11, 2013, a Craigslist ad promising companionship for $100 became the entry point to one of the most chilling murder cases in Pennsylvania history, a crime driven not by desperation, money, or rage, but by something far colder. At the center were newlyweds Miranda Barber and Elite Barber. Miranda was 19 years old. Elite was 22. They had married just weeks earlier in North Carolina and moved to central Pennsylvania, drifting between cheap motels and temporary housing. To the outside world, they were young, unstable, and barely noticed. Internally, they shared something far more dangerous, a fixation on killing together. Miranda placed the Craigslist ad offering female companionship. When 42-year-old Troy LaFerrara, a civil engineer from Port Trevorton, responded, there was nothing unusual about the exchange. He arranged to meet her that evening at the Susquehanna Valley Mall parking lot in Hummel's Wharf. Surveillance cameras later confirmed Miranda arriving alone and getting into LaFerrara's car. What he could not see was Elite hiding in the back seat under a blanket. Miranda directed LaFerrara to drive to Sunbury, roughly 6 miles away. During the ride, conversation remained casual. There were no signs of distress, no obvious warning. When Miranda told him to park near an alley, LaFerrara complied, believing the encounter was about to proceed as agreed. Instead, Elite emerged from the back seat and looped a cord around LaFerrara's neck, attempting to strangle him. LaFerrara fought back with surprising strength, breaking free and trying to escape from the moving vehicle. That moment marked the failure of the original plan, and Miranda immediately escalated. She pulled out a knife and stabbed LaFerrara repeatedly. Investigators later counted approximately 20 stab wounds. The victim, a 6'2", 278-pound man, bled to death as the couple dragged his body from the car and dumped it in a nearby alley. They then calmly left the scene. The murder was discovered shortly afterward. Police quickly identified Miranda through phone records, which showed the final call to LaFerrara's phone came from her number. Initially, she denied knowing him. When confronted with the evidence, her story changed completely. She and Elite were arrested within days. During interrogation, the couple offered a motive that stunned investigators. They did not claim self-defense. They did not claim panic. They said they killed Troy LaFerrara simply because they wanted to kill someone together. Miranda told police they had discussed it in advance, and that the act itself was the goal. There was no financial motive. The $100 was irrelevant. The killing was the point. The case took an even darker turn when Miranda Barber gave an interview to the Sunbury Daily Item from jail. In it, she claimed she had killed at least 22 people between 2008 and 2013 as part of a satanic cult she said she joined at age 13. She alleged murders across multiple states, including Alaska, Texas, North Carolina, and California. According to Miranda, her first killing occurred when a cult leader forced her to shoot a man who owed the cult money. Law enforcement took the claim seriously enough to investigate. The FBI and multiple police agencies reviewed unsolved cases, travel records, and timelines. None of Miranda's claims could be substantiated. No physical evidence, no matching victims, no corroborating witnesses. Authorities ultimately concluded that the only confirmed murder was Troy LaFerrara. Psychologists and prosecutors viewed the cult story as a mixture of fantasy, manipulation, and an attempt to inflate her own notoriety. Whether Miranda believed her own claims or used them strategically, the effect was the same. The focus returned to the crime that could be proven. Both Miranda and Elite Barber agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from consideration. At sentencing on September 18, 2014, the courtroom heard from Troy LaFerrara's family. His sister, Holly LaFerrara, delivered a statement that left little room for mercy. She described the couple as rotten to the core, people who completely lacked empathy and would never truly feel guilt, no matter how many years they spent behind bars. Elite Barber read a written apology, saying he did not understand what he had been thinking that night and admitting his actions were unforgivable. Miranda declined to speak at all. Judge Charles Saylor addressed both defendants directly. He said he struggled to comprehend their indifference to human life and described their crime as an act of pure predation. He sentenced each of them to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole, stating that justice required their permanent removal from society. Today, both Miranda and Elite Barber remain incarcerated in Pennsylvania state prisons. The Craigslist killer's case stands apart not because of how complex it was, but because of how simple the motive turned out to be. One man trusted a stranger. Two people wanted to see what it felt like to kill together. Only one of those choices was irreversible. Number 6. Eric Frein. On the night of September 12, 2014, the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Blooming Grove Township sat quiet, tucked into the dense woods of the Pocono Mountains. It was a place meant to represent order and safety. Instead, it became the site of a calculated ambush that would launch one of the largest manhunts in state history. The gunman was Eric Frein, a 31-year-old survivalist who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Frein lived a reclusive life shaped by anti-government beliefs and an obsession with guerrilla warfare. He trained in the woods, studied police movements, and kept detailed journals outlining his ideology. To him, law enforcement was not a public service, it was an enemy. That night, Corporal Brian Dixon and Trooper Alex Douglas were outside the barracks, sitting in their patrol vehicles. Without warning, rifle fire erupted from the darkness. Frein had positioned himself deep in the tree line, using the cover of the forest and the element of surprise. Multiple rounds were fired with precision. Corporal Dixon was struck and killed almost instantly. Trooper Douglas was hit as well, suffering serious injuries but surviving. The shooter vanished into the woods before officers could even identify where the shots had come from. Within hours, investigators realized this was not a random act. The shooting bore the hallmarks of planning and intent. Shell casings were carefully placed. The firing position had been scouted. This was an ambush designed to kill police officers. As dawn broke, Pennsylvania launched an unprecedented manhunt. Hundreds of law enforcement officers flooded the region. Helicopters scanned the forest canopy. Armored vehicles rolled through rural roads. Residents were told to stay inside as police searched cabins, campsites, and abandoned buildings. Schools were closed. Entire communities were effectively locked down. Eric Frein, meanwhile, moved like a ghost. He survived in the wilderness for weeks, relying on survival skills learned from his father and reinforced through years of practice. He broke into cabins for food and supplies, carefully avoiding detection. In his journal, Frein later wrote about the shooting in chilling detail, describing Corporal Dixon as still and quiet after being hit. The language showed no remorse, only observation. The search stretched on for days, then weeks. 48 days passed. Each failed lead heightened the tension. Authorities feared Frein would strike again. His writings revealed admiration for anti-government extremists and a desire to inspire others. He did not see himself as a criminal on the run. He saw himself as a soldier behind enemy lines. On October 30th, 2014, the manhunt finally ended. Frein was captured near an abandoned airport hangar in the Poconos after a tip led officers to his location. He was armed but taken into custody without gunfire. When asked why he targeted police, Frein did not deny it. He said he wanted to wake people up and believed killing law enforcement officers was justified. The trial began in 2017. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. Ballistics tied Frein's rifle to the shooting. Surveillance footage placed him near the barracks. His journals revealed intent, planning, and ideological motivation. The defense offered little resistance to the facts. focusing instead on Freen's mental state and background. The jury deliberated briefly. In April 2017, Eric Freen was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Corporal Brian Dixon, along with multiple additional charges, including attempted murder and terrorism-related offenses. The verdict was unanimous. At sentencing on April 27, 2017, the court considered whether Freen should ever be allowed back into society. Prosecutors argued the death penalty was appropriate, citing the calculated nature of the ambush and Freen's lack of remorse. The defense argued for life imprisonment, pointing to his isolated upbringing and extremist indoctrination. The judge disagreed with any notion of leniency. Eric Freen was sentenced to death. Today, Freen remains on Pennsylvania's death row. Corporal Brian Dixon is remembered as a dedicated officer who was simply doing his job when he was targeted and killed. Trooper Alex Douglas survived, carrying both physical and emotional scars from that night. The Eric Freen case stands as a reminder of how ideology, when combined with preparation and isolation, can turn belief into violence. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a mission, rehearsed in the woods, written in journals, and executed under cover of darkness, leaving a permanent mark on a community that never saw it coming. Number 7. Martin McNeil. In April 2007, what appeared to be a tragic accident inside a quiet Utah home slowly unraveled into one of the most disturbing cases of medical betrayal and calculated murder in modern American true crime. The man at the center was Martin McNeil, a respected physician, former prosecutor, and family man living in Pleasant Grove, Utah. To neighbors and colleagues, McNeil projected authority and intelligence. He understood the law. He understood medicine. Most importantly, he understood how to manipulate both. His wife, Michelle McNeil, was a 50-year-old mother of 8. Friends described her as devoted to her children and deeply involved in her church. Their marriage, however, was unraveling. Behind closed doors, Martin was carrying on an affair with a woman named Gypsy Willis, while simultaneously pressuring Michelle into cosmetic surgery she did not want. In early April 2007, Martin insisted Michelle undergo a facelift. She was hesitant, but he pushed relentlessly, framing it as beneficial and routine. Using his medical knowledge and influence, he arranged for the procedure himself. After the surgery, Michelle was prescribed multiple medications, including oxycodone, Valium, and Ambien, a dangerous combination that could severely impair consciousness and breathing. On April 11, 2007, just days after the procedure, Michelle was found dead in the bathtub of their home. Martin claimed he found her unresponsive and attempted CPR before calling emergency services. He told investigators she likely drowned accidentally due to complications from her surgery and medications. Initially, authorities accepted the explanation. Michelle's death was ruled an accident. No autopsy was performed. Martin was not charged. To the outside world, it was a tragic but plausible outcome. But to Michelle's daughters, something felt wrong. Within weeks of their mother's death, Martin introduced Gypsy Willis into the home, presenting her to the children as a nanny. The timing was shocking. The behavior was cold, and the explanation made no sense. Over time, Martin moved Gypsy into the house permanently. The girls began noticing inconsistencies in their father's stories and disturbing details about the night their mother died. Years passed. The suspicions never faded. In 2012, Michelle's daughters, particularly Alexis and Rachel McNeil, pushed investigators to reopen the case. This time, prosecutors looked deeper. They examined medical records. They reviewed Martin's prescription practices. They uncovered evidence that Martin had illegally obtained prescription drugs and may have used his medical knowledge to sedate Michelle before drowning her. Crucially, Forensic experts testified that the amount and combination of drugs in Michelle's system would have left her incapacitated. She could not have defended herself. She could not have climbed into the bathtub unaided. The theory of accidental drowning collapsed. The motive became clear. Martin wanted freedom. He wanted his mistress. Divorce would have cost him financially, socially, and professionally. Murder, disguised as an accident, solved all of those problems at once. In November 2013, after years of delay, Martin McNeil was convicted of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The jury rejected the idea of a tragic accident and accepted what the evidence showed: a husband who used his authority as a doctor to drug and kill his wife. But the case grew even darker. In July 2014, Martin was also convicted of sexually abusing his own daughter, Alexis, years earlier. The revelation reframed everything investigators thought they knew about him. The image of a controlling, predatory figure solidified. At sentencing on September 19, 2014, the judge imposed multiple consecutive sentences. Martin McNeil received 15 years to life for Michelle's murder, 1 to 15 years for obstruction of justice, and an additional 1 to 15 years for sexual abuse. The court made it clear that McNeil would likely never be free. Michelle's daughters addressed the court, describing years of silence, fear, and disbelief that their father had gotten away with killing their mother for so long. Their persistence, not the system, had ultimately delivered justice. Martin McNeil never served long enough to face the full weight of his punishment. On April 9, 2017, while incarcerated at Utah State Prison, Martin McNeil died by suicide. He left behind no apology, no confession, and no explanation. The case stands as a brutal example of how intelligence and authority can be weaponized. Martin McNeil did not kill in a moment of rage. He killed patiently, using medicine, trust, and legal knowledge to hide the crime in plain sight. It took 5 years, relentless daughters, and a second look for the truth to surface. By then, one woman was dead, a family was shattered, and a man who understood the system better than most had proven just how easily it could be exploited. Number 8. Ali Muhammad Brown. Between April and June 2014, a series of seemingly unrelated shootings across 2 states slowly revealed a pattern that law enforcement would ultimately classify as ideologically driven murder. A campaign of violence carried out not for money or personal grievance, but to make a statement. The man responsible was Ali Muhammad Brown, a 30-year-old drifter whose criminal path escalated into lethal extremism. Brown had a history of instability, prior arrests, and a growing fixation on global politics. By the spring of 2014, that fixation hardened into something far more dangerous. The first killing occurred on April 27, 2014, in Skyway, Washington, just south of Seattle. Leroy Henderson, a 30-year-old man with no connection to Brown, was shot and killed in what initially appeared to be a random act of street violence. There was no robbery, no argument, no clear motive. The case went cold almost immediately, treated as another tragic but isolated homicide. The second and third murders followed just over a month later, on June 1, 2014. Brown met Ahmed Saeed, 27, and Dwayne Anderson Young, 23, after contacting them through a gay dating app. The 3 met in Seattle, where Brown later shot both men at close range, killing them. Again, there was no robbery, no struggle, and no attempt to hide the violence. The randomness was deliberate. Investigators soon realized the victims had nothing in common except how they were targeted. That realization grew more disturbing when Brown was arrested weeks later and began talking. After the Seattle killings, Brown fled across the country to New Jersey. On June 25, 2014, he encountered Brendan Tevlin, a 19-year-old college student stopped at a traffic light in West Orange. Brown walked up to the vehicle and shot Tevlin at point-blank range, killing him instantly. Once again, the victim was chosen at random. Brown was arrested shortly afterward, carrying nearly $1 million in cash. During questioning, he did not deny the shootings. Instead, he explained them. Ali Muhammad Brown told police he was committing jihad. He claimed the murders were revenge for U.S. military actions in the Middle East. He described the killings as retribution and framed himself as a soldier acting on behalf of a larger cause. He expressed no remorse for the victims. In fact, he appeared proud of the attention the crimes were receiving. The admissions changed everything. What had initially looked like random violence was now understood as ideologically motivated murder. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions coordinated to ensure Brown would never be free again. In March 2018, Brown pleaded guilty in New Jersey to the murder of Brendan Tevlin. That conviction carried historic significance. In May 2018, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole under New Jersey's terrorism statute, making it the first time the state formally classified a homicide as terrorism-related. But New Jersey was only part of the equation. Brown was extradited back to Washington state to face charges for the 3 killings committed there. Prosecutors laid out the full scope of his actions, emphasizing the premeditation, the ideological motive, and the deliberate targeting of strangers. The argument was simple. These were not crimes of impulse. They were executions meant to send a message. In September 2023, Brown was sentenced in Washington to an additional 93 years in prison, stacked on top of his existing life sentence. The court made it clear that even without the New Jersey conviction, Brown would never leave prison alive. Families of the victims addressed the court, describing the unbearable randomness of the loss. None of the men Brown killed knew him. None had provoked him. Their lives were taken solely because Brown decided they would serve as symbols. Ali Muhammad Brown now serves life plus 93 years in prison, a sentence designed not just to punish, but to ensure permanent removal from society. His case stands as a stark reminder that ideology can be just as lethal as greed or rage when it strips victims of their humanity. 4 men were murdered not for who they were, but for what they represented in the mind of a killer who believed violence was justified. Brown achieved notoriety. What he did not achieve was meaning. The only legacy left behind is a trail of lives ended at random and families permanently scarred by a man who chose terror as his voice. Number 9. Joanna Dennehy. In March 2013, a violent spree unfolded across eastern England that was so cold, deliberate, and relentless it forced the British justice system to deliver one of its harshest possible sentences, one reserved for offenders deemed beyond any hope of rehabilitation. The woman responsible was Joanna Dennehy, a 31-year-old drifter whose crimes earned her the title Britain's Most Dangerous Woman. What set Dennehy apart was not just the brutality of her murders, but the complete absence of remorse and the clear enjoyment she took in the act of killing. Dennehy had lived a chaotic life marked by instability, drug abuse, and criminal behavior. She drifted between temporary housing, relationships, and acquaintances, leaving a trail of conflict behind her. By early 2013, she was associating with 2 men, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton, both of whom would later become her accomplices. Neither man initially understood the full extent of Dennehy's intentions, but both were eventually pulled into her orbit. The killing spree began in early March 2013 in Peterborough, England. Dennehy targeted men she viewed as disposable. Her first known victim was John Chapman, a 56-year-old man she stabbed to death after luring him to a deserted location. His body was dumped in a roadside ditch. Days later, she killed Kevin Lee, stabbing him repeatedly before abandoning his body in a similar fashion. Both murders were carried out with chilling efficiency. What shocked investigators later was how openly Dennehy talked about the killings. She told accomplices she enjoyed stabbing people and described a desire to kill more. This was not hidden rage or emotional explosion. It was appetite. Her third victim, Robin Kewish, was murdered just days later. Again, Dennehy used a knife, delivering fatal wounds before leaving his body near a road. The killings occurred over a span of just 10 days. Each murder reinforced a disturbing pattern. Dennehy was escalating, not slowing down. During this period, Dennehy told others she wanted to kill 9 men in total. She spoke openly about wanting to emulate infamous criminal partnerships, comparing herself to Bonnie and Clyde, but with a far more sadistic edge. To her, murder was not a means to an end, it was the end. As police began connecting the dots, Dennehy did not flee in panic. Instead, she continued moving casually, even bragging about what she had done. The spree finally ended when she stabbed Gary Stretch, one of her own accomplices, after an argument. He survived and provided critical information to authorities, helping them piece together the timeline of murders. Dennehy was arrested shortly afterward and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. From the moment she entered custody, her behavior confirmed investigators' worst fears. She showed no remorse. She smiled. She joked. She told mental health professionals that killing gave her a sense of power and control. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysis tied Dennehy directly to the murders. Witness testimony confirmed her confessions. Her own statements revealed an unfiltered fascination with violence. There was no credible defense. On February 28, 2014, at the Old Bailey in London, Judge Robin Spencer delivered his sentencing remarks. His words were unambiguous. He described Joanna Dennehy as cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative, a woman with a sadistic lust for blood. He concluded that she posed a permanent danger to the public. Dennehy was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning she will never be released from prison. She became only the 3rd woman in British history to receive such a sentence, joining Myra Hindley and Rosemary West. The ruling reflected the court's belief that no amount of time, treatment, or supervision could make her safe. In the years since, Dennehy has continued to reinforce that judgment. While incarcerated, she has assaulted prison staff and made further violent threats. Psychological evaluations consistently describe her as highly dangerous, with entrenched violent tendencies and no capacity for empathy. The Joanna Dennehy case stands out because it strips away familiar explanations. There was no financial gain, no revenge, no emotional trigger. These murders were committed because Dennehy wanted to kill, and she wanted to keep killing. 3 men lost their lives in 10 days. A 4th nearly died. The justice system responded with its strongest possible sanction, not out of emotion, but out of necessity. Joanna Dennehy will never walk free again. Her sentence is not about punishment alone. It is a recognition that some individuals do not want to change, do not regret what they've done, and cannot be allowed another opportunity to prove it. Number 10. Daniel Marsh. In April 2013, a quiet college town in Northern California became the setting for a crime so disturbing that even veteran investigators struggled to comprehend the mindset behind it. This was not a crime driven by rage, desperation, or ideology. It was driven by curiosity. The killer was Daniel Marsh, a 17-year-old high school student living in Davis, California. Marsh came from a stable background, attended school regularly, and showed no outward signs that he was on the verge of committing extreme violence. But beneath the surface, his thoughts were dark, detached, and fixated on one goal: becoming a serial killer. On the night of April 13, 2013, Marsh broke into the home of Oliver Northup, known as Chip, age 87, and Claudia Maupin, age 76. The couple were longtime residents of the community, well-liked, quiet, and entirely unconnected to Marsh. They were chosen not for who they were, but because they were accessible. Marsh entered the home armed with a knife. What followed was not a quick attack. Both victims were stabbed repeatedly. The violence escalated beyond what was necessary to cause death. After killing them, Marsh mutilated their bodies, carving symbols and inflicting post-mortem wounds. Investigators later described the scene as methodical and deeply unsettling, not chaotic. There was no attempt to steal anything, no attempt to conceal the bodies. The goal was not escape or profit. The goal was the act itself. When police arrived, they initially had little to go on. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear suspect. The brutality suggested an offender who was experimenting, testing boundaries, and learning. That realization immediately raised alarm. Crimes like this do not usually end after one incident. Suspicion soon turned toward Daniel Marsh after witnesses reported seeing him near the victim's home around the time of the murders. When questioned, Marsh initially denied involvement, but inconsistencies in his statements, combined with physical evidence, quickly closed in. During interrogation, Marsh's mask came off. He admitted to the murders calmly. He told investigators that killing the elderly couple made him feel pure happiness. He said he committed the murders out of curiosity, wanting to know what it felt like to kill. He explained that his ultimate objective was to become a serial killer, and that this was his first step. The statement stunned detectives. There was no remorse, no emotional conflict. Marsh spoke analytically, as if describing an experiment rather than a double homicide. He discussed how he chose the victims, what he learned, and what he might do differently next time. Psychological evaluations painted a disturbing picture. Marsh showed signs of severe antisocial traits and a lack of empathy. Experts testified that he was highly intelligent, highly manipulative, and extremely dangerous. The prosecution argued that Marsh represented a rare category of offender, someone who killed for internal gratification alone. Because Marsh was a minor at the time of the murders, the case became entangled in California's evolving juvenile sentencing laws. Prosecutors sought the maximum possible sentence, arguing that Marsh was beyond rehabilitation. The defense argued that his age and mental health should allow for the possibility of eventual release. In December 2014, Daniel Marsh was sentenced to 52 years to life in prison. The sentence made him eligible for parole after 25 years, a legal requirement due to his age at the time of the crime. The judge emphasized that while the law allowed for parole eligibility, Marsh would only ever be released if he could prove he no longer posed a danger, a standard few believed he could meet. For the families of Oliver Northup and Claudia Maupin, the sentence was devastating but final. They described the loss of two gentle, innocent people whose lives ended not because of conflict or chance, but because a teenager wanted to feel something. Daniel Marsh was sent to adult prison, where he remains today. Over the years, concerns have continued about his potential for violence. Evaluations have consistently highlighted the same issue. His lack of remorse and fascination with killing have not faded. The Daniel Marsh case stands apart because it removes every familiar explanation. There was no motive anyone can relate to, no grievance, no ideology, no gain. Two elderly people were murdered because a teenager wanted to see what it felt like. That is why the case still resonates. It forces a hard truth into the open. Some crimes are not about circumstances. They are about intent. And once that intent exists, no system, no warning sign, and no second chance can ever truly make the damage reversible.